I was looking at the last time I think we discussed Exodus 32 in detail, and it was when we were working our way through the Old Testament on a Wednesday evening, and that was in 2015, if I have that correct. You remember we started back there, I don't know, in 2013 or 2014 in Genesis 1:1, and then just started working through. And so it's been a little while since we've just spent our time on the golden calf incident. So that's what we're going to do this evening, and I have a list of points that I want us to get out of it. Now, I'll tell you, I really love this chapter in this section because the things that happen and God's response to it and Moses' response to it, all of that is just incredibly practical for us. This is not one of those sections where we have a hard time finding something to talk about or a lesson to apply to life today. It is just full of good, useful lessons for us today. But what I want us to do as we begin, I want you to have one primary thing in mind. All of this in chapter 32 happens because of what's recorded in verse 1. The people have observed what's going on, that Moses has delayed coming down from the mountain, and they assemble about Aaron and they say to him, "Come, let us make a God who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." I want you to focus in on that phrase, "we do not know." Everything that's going to happen after that is because they did not know. They did not have concrete understanding of what God was doing and how God was doing it. They didn't know what was happening, and that caused some degree of anxiety and then forced them, in their minds at least, to begin to want to get control over what was happening. And so their desire to know what God was doing created these events that take place. So right off the bat in verse 1, we could look at that and we could say, okay, what if the response had been, you don't have to know what Moses is doing. You don't have to know what's taken so long. What you have to do is what God told you to do. And he said, stay down here and wait. And if you would do that, everything would be okay. But they didn't do that. And the reason, again, is because they didn't know what was happening. Time had passed, more time than they thought was appropriate. That's what it is. In their mind, it has been too long. That's how they reasoned. And so they said, now we've got to do something about this. We have to take control of this situation. But that's not what God wanted them to do. What God wanted them to do was what he had already told them to do. It kind of reminds me just a little bit of King Saul. Remember when King Saul was waiting for Samuel to come and offer a sacrifice. And the day gets longer and longer, and all of a sudden Samuel's not here, and what does Saul do? I'll take care of it because it's been too long, and I'm going to control the situation. Had God told him to do that? He had not. And so it has a little bit of that to me. But it's really helpful for us to just pause on this idea of we don't know, and therefore we're going to have to intervene. We're going to have to do something. You see the same thing with Abraham and Sarah. God made a promise to us. We don't know how he's going to work that out, and time has gone by, and therefore we need control over the situation. We need to fill in the gaps. And it just seems to me that this is one of the things that we struggle with. It's one of the things that's hard. Maybe it's not hard for you. Maybe you have a really good handle on that. But many of us struggle with that, and we fight the desire to be in control and to know what's going on that God isn't revealing to us, that his system isn't providing for right now. I struggle with that. I do. Sometimes a little bit, sometimes a lot. And that's one of the reasons why I love sections like this, because it kind of settles me down and it says, wait a minute. You know what God has provided for you to know. You've already been told what you need to do. Let's just do that and be content with doing that. Any comments about that before we get into some of the lessons and work our way through the chapter? Anything you want to say about that? Yes, sir.
We got into that when we talked about Abraham and Sarah and the promise in chapter 12 of Genesis. This business of waiting 25 years, and then we talked about we're waiting for something that's eternal. We don't really even have a timeline on our own circumstances when that will be, but we want to see the promises to be there.
The waiting game we're involved in, if we can call it that, is lifelong. We will have questions until the day we die about death. We will have questions about the details of what happens when we die. Does the Bible tell us some of the things about that? Yes, it does. Does it tell us everything we want to know? Not at all. I can make a list. Not at all. But we just have to say, God has revealed what He has revealed. And that's what I need to be content with. And it's hard. I know that it is for some personalities especially. I know that. And it was hard for them, but we have to get comfortable with that. What God has revealed is what we need to know. Beyond that, we need to trust in Him. And that really is the foundational issue with them is it's been a long time. Moses has been up there a while. We don't know what's going on. Are we going to trust in what God's already told us to do, or are we going to have to do it our own selves? And that's where you see with Abraham and Sarah and so on. Yes, sir. Yeah, we have to get back to trusting what we do know. And it is, depending on circumstances, that's just a very difficult thing sometimes. I'm not discounting their difficulty. It was real to them. Our perspective is totally different on their difficulty, right? We know what's going on up on the mountain, and we can say to them, hold on, just hold on. It's going to be okay. But they didn't have the perspective we had. We have a different perspective post-COVID than we did in the middle of COVID. And so we learn and we grow. But I'll tell you, this problem exists for religious people, if we can say it like that, constantly. We don't want to be confined to the way God structured His church. We don't want to be confined to the things the church is supposed to do. We want to be able to do more than that. We want to be able to, well, and we'll get to it in our discussion, we want to have more exciting things. We want to be able to do more than simply what the New Testament church does in the Bible. I want more. Because I think if we were to do more, then it would be better. Right? Isn't that the logic? I think, it seems to me that if we could just do such and such, then it would be better. And that kind of thinking is what leads us to do things beyond the scope of what God's provided for, and it creates problems for us. And it's a challenge for everybody. Don't think that's everybody else's problem, and we never have that problem. We have to stay on top of that to the best of our ability, or we become just like them. And so that's why I think it's a really good practical thing for us to discuss. Yes, ma'am.
I think it's interesting that in having to do something, they did something completely evil.
Yeah.
And not, well, let's gather around and pray, or let's encourage each other for what we know God has told us. They just went completely away from God.
They did what they knew. Is that fair? They went back to what they knew, what was comfortable. They went back to what they knew. They did what was comfortable. And again, that is our tendency if we don't hold ourselves in check. We will go to what is comfortable for us eventually. So just some lessons. I don't know, there's 20 some odd lessons. I doubt we'll get to all of them, but we're just going to work our way through it and see what happens. The first one is, if you back up just a little bit into chapter 24 and verse 3, just by way of reminder about what God is doing. Verse 3, then Moses came and recounted to the people all the words of the Lord and all the ordinances, and all the people answered with one voice and said, let all the words which the Lord has spoken, all the words which the Lord has spoken, we will do. The people committed to doing what God told them to do, and implied in that, and we've lately discussed this in our authority discussions, implied in committing to do what God told you to do is only what God told you to do. That's a part of the process of doing God's will. It is doing God's will and that only, not adding to it. And the people had made that commitment, but here they forget about that commitment. And you and I can relate to that, because let me ask you this. Have you ever made a commitment to change your life from a spiritual standpoint? Ever decided you're going to do better and you've had to re-up on that commitment later on down the road? Most of us realize that it's easy to forget the things we committed to, the things that were on our minds. I have sat in the audience listening to a discussion of God's Word, a sermon out of God's Word, and thought to myself, I got to get control of that. I got to do better. I've got to do better. And then a couple days later, not think about that at all. Anybody? Am I the only one? Tell me I'm not the only one. I hope I'm not the only one. That happens. We forget the things that are important, and they did that. And that's the first lesson I want you to think about. The second one, verses 1 through 6 of chapter 32, is we can be really easily influenced. Not everybody, no, I understand, but some of us are really easily influenced. The way this reads in verses 1 through 6, it reads as a very simple process. It doesn't read like they had to get together and have a big convention to decide what they were going to do, and there were various factions and people were arguing, no, we need to do this, and no, we need to stay with what God said. It doesn't appear that at all. Somebody had the bright idea of this is what we need to do, and everybody said, okay, we're just going to do that. That's what we're going to do. And so we need to be careful about being easily influenced. Are there times when we definitely need to be influenced? Surely there are. So you get the point that we're making. We have to be careful about the influence that we allow into our lives. We have to own that, and sometimes we have to back up and make changes regarding that. We just have to do that. So that's one of the things that pops into my mind about this section. If you have a comment, grab my attention. Get a hold of me, because I'm going to try to move through these fairly quickly. Some will take more time than others. Another thing that I think we need to understand in this section, verses 2 through 6, is that sacrifices, burnt offerings, verse 6, must be lawful. Now, I've written these as concisely as possible to fit them on a screen. But when I first wrote that, it was not that concise. The whole idea is that whatever we do to God, for God, in view of God, in relation to God, has to be according to His law. To me, there is no better passage in my mind to describe that process in the New Testament than Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, beginning, where Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven will enter. And then in verse 22, he says, many will say to me on that day, and you know this passage, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name? So people are going to say to Jesus, we did a bunch of stuff. We offered sacrifices. We offered burnt offerings. We were religious people in your name. And what does verse 23 say? Then I will say to them, depart from me. I never knew you, you who practice what? Iniquity. The root word is lawlessness, is acting without law. I've always been impressed by the fact, with two things, really. The first thing is the people to whom Jesus makes that statement were believers in Jesus. That's the first thing. They were believers and worshipers of Jesus. And then the next thing that's always been striking to me about it is Jesus doesn't say, no, you didn't. He doesn't deny their works. Ever. He just says, you did your own thing, not my thing. It's that Nadab and Abihu business that I always think about. They offered fire to the Lord, but it wasn't what He required. It was strange fire. They offered something other than what He required. The hard part about that to me is that none of that subject means that forgiveness isn't available and grace isn't available. It doesn't mean that. What it means is, if my mentality and attitude is, I'm going to do what suits me and God's going to have to accept it, then I'm not going to be accepted. It's simply not going to work. Cain and Abel proved that for us in Genesis chapter 4, right? Did Cain offer a sacrifice to the Lord? He did. God never said, no, you didn't offer a sacrifice. So, to me, a really valuable lesson for us out of the first paragraph up to verse 6 is if we're going to rise up, verse 6, early and offer burnt offerings and peace offerings, then we better be sure they are the ones God wants. We have to do that to the best of our ability. And that means we have to push away the things that are what we want and settle in on what He has already revealed. And that gets back to trusting Him, faith in Him and His system, that it's adequate, that it will do what it's intended to do instead of interjecting my ideas into it. Comments about that before we leave that point? Yes, sir.
One of the things that a bunch of us have noticed, and rightly so, when we got to Exodus 21, and up to this point or even past it, God is very interested in the details of worship. We saw that in the construction of the tabernacle, we see that in the priestly garments, we see that in the offerings.
Tremendous detail.
Tremendous amount of detail. He's always been interested in detail, and we've made the comments amongst ourselves during our weekly, our daily reading. Man, there's a lot of detail in Exodus. Well, there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
God's interested in details.
It is the nature of God to demand to be worshiped a certain way. And that's okay because He's God. And let me ask you this. Does that mean that we are always in every service at the pinnacle of that in our execution? We know that we can, quote, do better. Are we obligated to do better? Yes. Are we obligated to strive to worship Him in spirit and in truth more than we did last time? Obviously, because of who He is and because of our great need for Him and all of that. But we can't change it. We can't turn it into something other than what He has said it is to be. And so that's one of the foundational principles that this local church was built on back in 1964. We're just going to try to worship God according to the New Testament pattern. That's the goal. And again, it doesn't mean we always are at the pinnacle of that. It means that is the thing to which we strive, not to please ourselves or to entertain or things like that. The next point in verse 4 is what we've already mentioned. Leaving the old way is difficult. It's just hard. It's harder for some than it is for others. I always think about this. I always think about Galatians 2:20 and the value of the old man, new man, or the dead to sin, alive to Christ concept. Galatians 2:20, remember Paul there says, "For I have been crucified with Christ," dead. I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. So the life that I now live, he says, in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave Himself up for me. So the idea is I died and now I've started a new life. That is such a biblical principle, but such a helpful principle for us as far as leaving the old way behind. Because if the old way actually is dead, then it's not easily resurrected. It's not easily gone back to. And if we can push that in our minds, that I don't live like I used to live. I'm a new creature, a new person, and I have to force myself to become and to remain new, then that's really helpful for us. That is a basic principle of Christianity. And all of that is based upon Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And that's the value of Romans 6, 3, 4, 5, right in there. Because Paul makes that argument really, really well. And he says our process of becoming Christians is similar to what Jesus did. He died on the cross, He was entombed, and then He rose again. And that's what Christians do. We die to sin, we're entombed in baptism, and then we start a new life. We cannot have the new life without the death. It doesn't work. We cannot have the new life without the burial. It doesn't work. And so to understand what Jesus is after there, we just have to do it all. And that helps me with this leaving the old way. Because again, some folks don't struggle with this. Others of us do. And it's just personality and the way we're made. Some folks really have a hard time with it. So that's always a good point to consider out of verse 4 because they went straight back to, we're going to make ourselves a god. Said the same thing in verse 1, we're going to make ourselves a god. By the way, did they know that the calf they were going to make is not the thing that led them out of Egypt? Did they know that in a literal sense? Sure they did. They knew that. They knew that calf that they just made that wasn't there when the plagues were going on, had nothing to do with, so then why'd they do it? Why'd they do it? I got to have something.
It's not faith-based.
I've got to have something. I've got to be in control. I have to know. I have to be involved. I have to be able to put my hands on it. I have to have something. And the only something I can get is what the Egyptians taught us, I got to have the thing. And so they had the thing, and that's what they did. So I know it's challenging and hard to leave the old way, but God has provided a system that lives it out for us in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, the death, burial, and resurrection of ourselves. The system is designed to take us away from the old life where we can't get back to it. And I'm thankful for that because it is a very vivid reminder of what we're supposed to be trying to do. Fifth one is, do fun and games equal worship? Well, no, they don't. In verse 6, they offered burnt offerings, peace offerings, and they sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. I'm a big believer, personally, in playing, getting together and playing and spending time just enjoying the life God has given us and the associations we have with each other and all of that. I believe in that. I love that. I enjoy that. Sometimes that wears me out, and it's a good thing. I like that. But that is not this. It'll never be this. And this is not enhanced by that. That is enhanced by this. Did that make sense? You see where we're going with that. The idea is what we do in worship to God stands alone. There is no correlation anywhere else. What we do in worship to God stands by itself, and it is what it is without connection to anything else that we do in life. We worship Him. The fun and games and the things that we enjoy and all of that have their own time, and we will do those things on their own time, and we won't try to mix and mingle. One of the tendencies these days, and it's been that way since at least I was a kid, is if we can infuse enough fun and games into the worship, then more people will want to participate in worship. What's wrong with that? Don't we want more people to participate in worship? If we infuse worship with fun and games, then more people will want to participate in worship. What's wrong with that? Well, it won't be worship. When we infuse worship with anything, it is no longer the worship God has required of us. What is the answer to our worship needs to be more vibrant, our worship needs to be more enthusiastic, our worship needs to be better? What is the answer to that?
The truth component, the spirit component.
Yeah, who's responsible for that? Each person is. We've said this, I know, a lot over the years, but if our singing isn't what we want our singing to be, what do we need to do? We need to sing more. That's what we need to do. If our praying isn't what we want our praying to be, what do we need to do? We need to pray more. We need to work on that because it's God we're dealing with here. This transcends the song leader, the guy leading the prayer, or the Bible class teacher, or the preacher. It's not that. It is all of us worshiping God together. And if my whole heart isn't in that, then I have a problem. If our whole hearts are not in that, then we have a problem. And so the answer is we have to spend more time getting close to God and honoring God and loving God and being thankful and expressing gratitude. And there's all kinds of ways we can do that, but bringing in bounce-arounds probably isn't the best way to enhance our worship to God. Is that fair? I like bounce-arounds, by the way. I have no problem with them. Worship stands on its own, and we just have to remember that. And then connected to that, verse 8, our way is not God's way. The things that I think will make it better really don't have anything to do with it. I have written out in my notes Isaiah 55, verses 8 and 9. You remember that? Turn over there with me. I know we sometimes quote that, but I'd like for us to read it together. Isaiah 55. Go over there with me, please, to Isaiah 55. In Isaiah 55, the section is about God's mercy, that God is granting mercy, and He's that kind of a God. And it says in verse 8, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, declares the Lord." I like the way the New American Standard says that. God declares that. He states that emphatically. And then verse 9, "For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." It's His point of view that helps us settle into our place. And our place is to simply do what he has asked and trust in him that it will be as effective as he wants it to be. One other thing that fits with this is Romans chapter 1 and verse 16. What is the power of God unto salvation? What is the power of God unto salvation? The gospel of Christ. Listen, nothing else is the power of God unto salvation. There is no enhancement to the gospel that is more powerful. It is just that. And we have to trust in that. Now, we can't sit back and say, well, the gospel is the power of God unto salvation, and I sure hope everybody finds it. That's not the response he's looking for. It's our job to preach and teach the gospel, to spread the gospel. And we can do better. But we cannot change the gospel or add to the gospel. Then it is no longer the gospel, and it is no longer the power of God unto salvation. It may sound good. And we're down to 11 minutes. Go.
Brother Warren connected us very nicely on this 6th point in Hebrews 7:14, the business of when God legislates, all other options are on the table.
Yeah.
And he did not tell them to not make a golden calf. He didn't instruct them, he just said, you'll never know what they're going to do.
Yeah, he doesn't have to tell us everything to not do when he has told us what we should do, what he requires of us. And I agree with that. That was a marvelous point that Brother Berkeley made at the end of our series on Bible authority, the silence of the Scriptures. Really, really valuable stuff. Next point on the list is his way is best for us. We go back just a little bit into chapter 31 to really get that, but it fits in the context of where we are in 32. What God has designed for us is for our interest, for our best interest. He always has designed systems that are best for us if we will adhere to them. That is because he loves us and he cares for us, and that's what he has done for us. And that reminds me of Jeremiah 10 and verse 23, where he says, I know, O Lord, that a man's way is not in himself, nor is it in a man who walks to direct his steps. The idea is God knows what's best. He knows the steps that ought to be taken. And if we will follow what he has said, then our lives will be the best they can be here, but that's a secondary concern. The primary concern is they will eventuate in eternity. So just remember, God's way is the best way. Then the next point, corruption, if it comes from us. It's that Matthew 15 principle where the things that proceed out of our hearts are the things that defile us. The things the world is doing will not defile us. The things you are doing will not defile me. The things that defile me are the things that come out of my heart, my attitudes, my principles and adopted beliefs. Those are the things that if I'm going to be defiled or corrupted, those are the things that are going to do it. Let me say all of that a different and simpler way. Satan cannot force you to do anything. Satan cannot damn you to hell. You are in complete control of whether or not you end up in heaven or hell. And so we have to get to a point to where we say, if I am corrupted, if I am defiled, it is of my own doing and I need to fix that. Do we have to fix that from time to time? Do Christians have to repent and change from time to time? Surely we do. And aren't we thankful that God has allowed for that? And so it takes a bit of humility for us to do that. It takes self-awareness for us to do that. But we are certainly willing to do that because corruption comes from within us, not from without us. And then verse 9, there the Lord in verse 9 refers to them as an obstinate or stiff-necked or stubborn people. The New American Standard says obstinate. I've said many times to you that being stubborn is not necessarily a bad thing. It depends on what you're stubborn about, right? And so we want our young folks to have a bit of hard-headedness about them where they're not easily talked into things and easily influenced by others and all of that. That's not what God's talking about here. When he says that they are an obstinate people, what he means is they're not listening and learning. That's what he means. They're not hearing the information that I'm giving to them. And a lot of times the reason I don't hear is because I already know. I'll say that for you again. The reason I'm not hearing you is because I already know pretty much everything. I mean, pretty much. right? Isn't that our attitude? I mean, does anybody walk around saying, I don't know anything, and my opinion is terrible, and any opinion I might have is useless? Does anybody walk around with that attitude? Or are we more tempted to walk around with an attitude that says, my opinion is the one that really matters, and my opinion is more informed than yours, and I'm a little bit smarter than you, quite frankly, and I know what I'm doing. And therefore, I don't need you to tell me what to do. That enters me into the obstinate, stiff-necked category. And when I'm there, I'm not learning a thing. I'm not getting anything from what you are saying, from the good advice you might be giving. It's just not getting in because I already know everything. And that's where these people were. God is doing the talking here. This is not Moses, as if it would matter, but God is the one saying, from his perspective, this group of people is obstinate, hard-headed, stiff-necked. That is amazing to me, given the last few weeks of their lives. It is amazing to me. And therefore, I can safely conclude from that it's amazing to me, given the last couple of months of their lives, I can conclude that it is amazing to God how hard-headed I can be about something, given what he has done for me lately and how he has blessed me and the good counsel he has put in my life and how I will ignore it from time to time. I don't know about you, but I can make a pretty good list of good advice I've been given that I just ignored, counsel that I have received that I didn't put into practice. We don't want to be obstinate, hard-headed people. Anything about that?
That ultimately will deter us from being penitent.
Yeah, it gets to a point to where I back myself in a corner. If I have to be right, if I've taken the position that I'm always right, and certainly right on this, then it's harder for me to repent. It's harder for me to say, I need to make a change. And I think it's important to say this. Now, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings in here, but everybody struggles with that about something sometime. No one's immune to that. You may be handling it really well, better than most of us, but everybody struggles with that. And we need a humility that says, maybe I'm not always right. Maybe I do need to listen to what other people say. Maybe I do need to take some, and maybe I need to be willing to say, I wasn't right about that. David?
Jeremiah in his day dealt with this very, very same thing, and specifically in chapters 5 and 8.
That's very good. Very good. And wasn't it to Ezekiel that God said, I'm sending you to a stubborn and hard-headed people? And he told Ezekiel to, was it harden his forehead? Is that what he told him to do? The idea is you put your hard hat on and you get in there and you tell them what they need to hear anyway. And then God says, but they're not going to listen. We don't want to be that. Let's just agree together that we're not going to be that. We're not going to be folks who say, I'm not going to listen. I already know everything. We've got a long way to go and a short time to get there. Don't think the song. Don't do that. Verse 10, God gets angry. He is very angry about what takes place. But then verse 14, God relents. Now, Moses and God have a unique relationship. God will relent more than once in dealing with Moses. God relented earlier in dealing with someone else about the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Remember that? And so God has the ability to relent. Does that mean God was wrong? Everybody go like this. No. Is God justified in his anger? Surely he is. He is justified. Does he have the ability to change course if he so chooses? When you're God, you have that ability. When every decision you make is just and right, you have that ability. Next point, God communicates his will, verses 15 and 16. The reason that point is up there is because we don't ever need to get in our minds in this section or anywhere else that God hasn't given me enough information to make the decisions I need to make. Don't ever let that get into your mind. Don't start thinking, but if God would have told me this, or if God would have revealed a little bit more, I would be willing to serve him if he'd have told me a little more about what happens when I die. Then I would be willing to do what he wants me to do. Don't get into that habit, because that leads to a place where, listen, you're not going to be satisfied. You'll never be satisfied. God has communicated his will sufficiently. And it's our job to take what he's given us, deal with it appropriately, but then trust him for the rest of it. There's folks who are a whole lot smarter than me who've come up with lists of questions that the Bible doesn't answer a whole lot longer than I could. Their list is longer because they're smarter and they can think of things that I hadn't thought about. It doesn't make any difference. If God hasn't answered it, I don't need to know it right now. We just have to be able to take what he has communicated and respect it. Verse 19, Moses gets angry. He's coming down the mountain, he gets angry. He throws the tablets, breaks the tablets. Remember that? Verse 16 says the tablets were God's work, and the writing was God's writing engraved on the tablets. Moses got mad in verse 19, and his anger burned, it says in the New American Standard. He threw the tablets from his hands and shattered them at the foot of the mountain. Moses is fired up as well. Is Moses righteous in his anger? Surely he is. It appears that Moses' anger doesn't settle down quite as quickly as God's did. Verse 20 has always been striking to me. We've got to get verse 20. We have 2 minutes left. Verse 20, he took the calf which they had made and burned it with fire and ground it to powder and scattered it over the surface of the water and made the sons of Israel drink it. That did not happen in 4 minutes. Okay, that took them a while. And can you imagine standing around while Moses is busy working over there? And you're like, oh boy, this is not going to be good. Wonder what he's going to do with that. He burned it with fire and then ground it into a powder. So what had to happen? At the very least, the gold it got hot again, and then it had to cool down, and then he smashed it, ground it into a powder, threw it in the water, and made them drink it. Okay. Sometimes God's people need correction, right? So do you think they were mad at Moses? I mean, wouldn't you be mad at Moses if he made you do that? I mean, come on, Moses. You didn't have to do that. A lot of times when the correction comes to us, we get mad at the person bringing the correction. I mean, I'm telling you, that's the tendency some of us struggle with. Maybe you don't. Some of us struggle with that terribly. The correction comes, and so I'm mad at the person who gave the correction. What came to my mind is 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 2, where Paul tells Timothy, preach the word, be ready in season and out of season, reprove, rebuke, exhort with great patience, right? You do that. Why? Why do we do that? Because the time will come, he says. The time's going to come when they're not going to want to listen to you. And so you have to do that. Does that mean Timothy was perfect in his preaching, and Timothy was perfect in his living, and Timothy was therefore the one qualified to do the preaching of the word? Has nothing to do with it. Nothing to do with it. Timothy is supposed to preach the word, and that's what he did. One of the things that I've always been impressed with, 30 seconds left, I've always been impressed with, is the way this congregation handles the correction of the word, not of an individual, that's not it, of the word. This group of folks just wants to serve God and get better and do what they need to do. And I think that is a remarkable thing, and that encourages those of us who struggle with that some to deal appropriately with it. Correction is necessary, and God's Word provides for it. A couple of things real fast on the next page. Parties don't last. Think, they're having one, but Moses put a stop to it. Think Ecclesiastes 7 and verse 2, right? It's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting. The party won't last, eternity's forever, so we need to have the right perspective and not get hung up on entertainment and having a good time and all of that. We're going to run through them real quick. Aaron was responsible, but he didn't take responsibility. Aaron was responsible, but he didn't lead. A whole good sermon comes out of that for all of us. Every one of us. Nobody's exempt from a sermon like that, a discussion like that. Don't be a follower of men. Out came this calf. Boy, that makes for a good sermon any way you go. Aaron's excuse. Okay. Mine certainly do. The people were out of control. That's what God said. The people that were out of control. Aaron had refused to maintain control over the people, indicating that was his responsibility. Sometimes you have to choose sides. Moses tells them, gather up, and if you're on God's side, come over here, and if you're not, go over there. Sometimes life is like that, and we just have to have the courage to choose the side we need to be on and be proud of it. And then spiritual wins over family every time, and that's an imperative. And then consequences without forgiveness is in verse 33. That's all we've got. Thank you.